Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth spoilers. So it's a weekend, so it's kind of a light spoiler day, but we still got some really sweet and interesting cards to talk about, which probably means we should jump right into it, start talking spicy new Lord of the Rings cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. Number one, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And number two, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Lord of the Rings. So first up today, we got a new legendary artifact in Palantir of Orthanc, and this card I think is actually pretty interesting. So 3 mana, so at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on it and scry 2, then target opponent may have you draw a card. If they don't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on it, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of cards milled this way. So how I imagine this plays is the first turn you run it out, you're going to scry 2, and your opponent's likely going to have you mill a card. Because milling 1, they're probably not going to take that much damage, even with the scry letting you kind of set up the top of your deck. The next turn, you're going to mill 2 cards, and your opponent probably still going to be okay with that. How much damage can it be? But once you get up to 3 counters, or 4 counters, your opponent might have to start letting you draw a card every turn, and when this is draw a card each turn rather than mill, it's actually really, really good. If you can get to that point where there's enough counters on this that your opponent is afraid of the combustible gear Hulk aspect, where they're afraid if they have you mill 3, 4, 5, 6 cards, they're going to take 10 damage, 20 damage, and you're drawing a card every turn, it's essentially a preordain each turn. Or think about Phyrexian Arena. Phyrexian Arena, a really, really good card in Commander, and that's just every turn on your upkeep, you draw a card and lose a life. This is a better colorless version of that if you can get to the point where your opponent is always going to choose to have you draw. The question is, how do you get to that point? How do you manipulate your deck or the game state so you're going to be drawing a card every single turn off of this? Because if you get to that point, this card is really absurd. So as far as 60 card formats, I don't think this is a staple by any means, but there are a couple of places that I'm kind of interested in playing it. The first one I thought of is Turbo Fog. If you've never seen Turbo Fog, the whole idea is just cast a fog every turn to fizzle your opponent's damage and then win eventually. But for this plan to work, you need extra card draw. So the deck usually plays like Howling Mine style effects. I could see Palantir being a replacement for Howling Mine. The upside is your opponent's never going to benefit from it. A Howling Mine, both players draw, so you're generating card advantage for your opponent. Palantir is never going to do that, so if your opponent lets you draw, well, that's great. You scry 2, you draw, you get to find your fogs. If your opponent chooses to let you mill, then Palantir kind of your finisher. You try to fog enough that eventually Palantir is going to burn your opponent out of the game. Could also be interesting in some artifact strategies. Like, it works really well with Metalwork Colossus. Metalwork Colossus, 11 mana, but it's usually free if you get a bunch of artifacts. So it wants a bunch of artifacts, especially non-creature artifacts like Palantir on the battlefield, and then it's also 11 mana, so if you mill it, that's a ton of damage, plus it likes being in the graveyard, so if you mill it, that's good. Could also maybe see it in some Karn decks, especially Karn-Tron style decks, where you can just play Palantir as a 1-of in your sideboard, tutor it out, and in a Tron deck, you're going to have a bunch of Ugins and Big Karns and maybe Eldrazi that are high mana value, so your opponent's kind of incentivized to let you draw each turn, because if they choose to mill, there's a chance you just mill an 8-drop or an 11-drop, and they lose on the spot, or lose half of their life on the spot. So I could see these decks wanting to try Palantir in 60 card formats. I don't expect it to be a staple or anything like that, but there are some fun brews that you can build around it. As far as Commander, on one hand, in most decks, I think it's worse than the One Ring. So I'm a huge fan of Phyrexian Arena effects. We talked about Phyrexian Arena before. Just draw an extra card every single turn. I love those style of permanents in Commander. I think, though, if you want a colorless version of that, most of the time, the One Ring is just going to be better. You get the protection, then you get an increasing number of cards each turn. Sure, you're going to take some damage, but whatever, you can work around that. So I think that Palantir is kind of like a poor man's version of the One Ring to some extent. Oh, the One Ring at home, let's say. But there are certain archetypes where I think Palantir might actually be better than the One Ring. So for one, scry decks. There's not a ton of these, but like Elgith really wants you to scry because it turns your scrying into card draw. In a deck like Elgith, Palantir is kind of insane because on your end step, you're just drawing 2 each turn. You don't care what your opponent chooses, just the scry 2 is going to make it worth it. It's also very interesting in graveyard decks like Madroltha or Osgir just want things in the graveyard. If you can benefit from having cards in your graveyard, it puts your opponent in a really tough position. If they choose to mill, you're kind of drawing cards anyway because your commander can take advantage of the cards in your graveyard. If they choose to let you draw, then you build a better Phyrexian Arena, which is already a really good card. So if you can take advantage of your graveyard, Palantir goes way up in value. It's also sneaky in high mana value decks like Vile Smasher the Fierce or Yuriko. Really wants a bunch of expensive permanents in your deck because when you cast them, you get to deal damage to your opponent or reveal them to Yuriko. I think that Palantir could work there as well because remember, the way I'm looking at this is you want to manipulate the game state to build a better Phyrexian Arena. Like, that's the goal. You want the preordain every single turn, and if you're playing a Vile Smasher deck or Yuriko deck, your opponent's probably going to let you draw the card because they're going to be afraid that you have a 15 drop on the top of your library and they're just going to die. So I think Palantir, it's a really interesting card. I can see Palantir actually showing up in some commander decks, especially those graveyard decks or high mana value decks. Worst case, maybe you can just politic your way into a better Phyrexian Arena. Like, if you can turn this into scry 2 draw a card every turn, I would play this in basically any commander deck. I play Phyrexian Arena in any black deck I possibly can, and this is like a colorless version of Phyrexian Arena if you can manipulate the game to that state. So I actually really like this card. Might be worse than the One Ring, and I'm not sure how good it'll be in 60 card formats, but in those graveyard or high mana value commander decks, Palantir could actually be an all-star. We also got a weird new Azorious legend in Faramir, Prince of Illithid. So 4 mana 3/3 legendary human noble. It says at the beginning of your end step, choose an opponent. At the beginning of that player's next end step, you draw a card if they didn't attack you that turn. Otherwise, create 3 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens. So if the player you chooses does attack you, you get 3 1/1s. If they don't attack you, you get to draw a card. I think this card is kind of interesting, although I will say it's pretty generic as far as building around it. I'm not sure how many options there are. I don't think this is really designed to be a 60 card format card. Its stats just aren't really good enough, but it does have 2 decent abilities. If you think about what its abilities do, if you didn't get attacked, you get to draw a card, which is like a bad opt. You get 1 mana value worth of spells. If you do get attacked, then you get 3 1/1s, which theoretically can defend you from the next attack, the next turn cycle. In 3 1/1s, that's like a Hordling Outburst. That's worth probably 3 mana. So that's certainly the more value of the 2 modes in a vacuum, I would say. The question is, what do you actually do with this card? How do you build around Faramir? And I guess it's trying to control combat, trying to control whether your opponents attacked you or didn't attack you. As far as 60 card formats, a 4 mana 3/3 is just not big enough. That's a hill giant. It's a legendary hill giant at that. So I would be absolutely shocked if we saw Faramir in a format like Modern. It's just a little bit too slow. Although I will say, the way its ability works, if I understand the rules right, so you play Faramir, go to your end step, you choose an opponent. At this point, you're going to get its ability at least once, even if it dies. Let's say you choose an opponent and they wrath the board and kill your Faramir, or just use a Swords to Plowshares and kill your Faramir. That second trigger will still trigger on their end step. It's this weird delay trigger type thing. So you should get its ability at least once, even if it dies. So not quite as strong as the ETB trigger. It could die before you get to your end step, but it does give you some value right away. So how would you go about building Faramir in a format like Commander? And I think the simplest way is to just control combat. Play Stonehorn Dignitaries, Propagandas, Ghostly Prisons, Binding Angels, Ensnaring Bridge, things that make it difficult for your opponent to attack you, or things that make it difficult for your opponent to attack you a lot. And then you're just drawing an extra card each turn, and when you do get attacked, you get some blockers. You could also go the other direction and try to be a token deck and force your opponent to attack you. Although many of the best make your opponent's attack you cards are in red, so it's not really in Faramir's colors. counters, but if you're getting 3 1/1s out of this pretty consistently and not dead, which is a concern if you're making your opponents attack you, you can actually get a lot of value out of that, especially in white where you got Annoyant Procession to make even more tokens, Intangible Virtue, Skullclamp to turn those tokens into cards. So Faramir, I don't know. It's an interesting card. It's a unique design, something we haven't really seen before. To me, it seems a little bit generic. Like, for me personally, I'm not really hyped to build a commander deck around it. And like I said, I don't think it's gonna really make it in 60 card formats, but I'm curious, what do you think about this card? Is there any reason to build a commander deck? What direction would you go building Faramir Commander? Definitely let me know about that in the comments. We also got the Ring Goes South, a new green ramp spell. So 4-mana sorcery. The Ring tempts you, and remember the Ring tempts you, first mode makes a creature legendary, and then you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X lands, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. Put all lands revealed this way onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So, on an empty board with no legends, you get to ramp once with this because you should turn your Ring Bearer into a legend. So worst case, I guess if you have any creature on the battlefield, you get 1 land for 4 mana. That's not very good. 2 lands for 4 mana, that's still not very good. 3 lands for 4 mana, that's where this starts to become more exciting. And anything above 3 is actively good. So I guess the question for this card is, how many legends are you going to have on the battlefield? On turn 4, it's going to be a little tricky to have too many legends unless you're playing like a Rogak deck or something that just has a commander that's 0 mana or whatever. So it might be a little bit tricky to maximize its value. We've seen several takes on this card in the past, like Traverse Outlands lets you get basic lands equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Harvest Season, basics equal to the number of tap creatures you control. Celebrate the Harvest, basics equal to the number of different powers among creatures you control. And honestly, these cards, none of them have developed into generic staples. You do see them show up in very specific decks, like Traverse Outland shows up in Yargle and Lutani because you have an 18 power commander. So if you can actually pull that off, you're going to get a ridiculous number of lands. I think the Ring Goes South is going to be kind of similar. Most decks, you're going to stick with, your Explosive Vegetation, whatever ramp spells you've already been playing. But in specific decks, I think the Ring Goes South has some big upside. And one of the biggest reasons is it's worded like Open the Way. Open the Way kind of does the same thing where you get to reveal lands and put them into play. The Ring Goes South is very similar, and the big upside of this is it lets you get non-basic lands. One of the problems with all the other versions of these cards, and even a lot of traditional ramp spells that are heavily played in Commander, is they only get basic lands, and this is a challenge in 2023 when there's so many good non-basic lands. There's actually a cost to playing 10 basic lands, 15 basic lands in your deck, because you really want to get that value out of all this sweet utility lands and non-basics. The Ring Goes South totally avoids this problem, and that's a really big deal, especially because some of the decks that would want this the most would be like 5-color Joda, 5-color Sisay Legends, 5-color Azika Legends, and in 5-color decks, you just can't afford many basic lands, so basic land tutors are actively bad in decks like that. You just run out of lands too quickly. But in like a Joda deck, you're going to flood the board with legends, and then you Ring Goes South, and you don't care that you don't have any basic lands. You're going to be hitting Triomes and Shock lands and other dual lands and utility lands. So I think in a deck like that, the Ring Goes South could be really, really good. But I think it's also in the conversation for pretty much any Legendary Matters deck. Just know that it's going to be a little bit inconsistent. Like, there's going to be situations where this is the best card in your deck, and it's ramping you 5 lands or something, and it is obscene. There's also going to be situations where this is the worst card in your deck, that your opponent wrath the board, and you have no creatures, and the Ring Goes South does literally nothing. Most of the time, people tend to play the more consistent cards, so we'll have to wait and see. Like, if the choice is between this and Explosive Vegetation, the ceiling is way lower. It's never going to get you 5 lands and go off and be spectacular, but it also has a much higher floor. Its floor is way higher because you're always going to get those 2 lands. The Ring Goes South has an incredibly high ceiling where the best case for this is the best ramp spell in Magic. Like, the dream is you have 20 legends and you ramp every land out of your deck, and it is ridiculous, but the floor is 4 mana do quite literally nothing. So I guess keep that in mind. I think it's really going to depend on your deck though. In those those 5-color legend decks, I think this could be good enough to sneak into some of your ramp slots. Otherwise, if you're not a full-on legendary tribal deck, I wouldn't even consider this and just stick to more consistent options. We also got a new blue instant, Impress the Enemy. So 4-mana instant, return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand, and you can cast an instant or sorcery spell with equal or lesser mana value from your hand without paying its mana cost. So Press the Enemy kind of compares to Unsubstantiate, Divide by Zero, these spells that can bounce something on the stack or from the battlefield. Press the Enemy, the least restricted of the bunch. It hits any spell or any non-land permanent your opponent controls, while Unsubstantiate only bounces creatures. Divide by Zero even has a little restriction, mana value 1 or greater, so it can't bounce tokens. Press the Enemy bounces anything. On the other hand, it is also the most expensive of the bunch. In 60 card formats, it's really tough to leave up 4 mana for an effect like this. 4 mana is just a little bit too much. That said, there is one place in Modern this card really interests me, and that is using it to cast no mana value spells like Crashing Footfalls, Restore Balance, Living End. We've seen decks in the past do this with like Electro Dominance, which works kind of similarly, deals damage, and then you can play a card with mana value X or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. We've seen As Foretold be used in these decks. I think that Press the Enemy could have a home there. Sure, 4 mana is still a lot, but if it's 4 mana, bounce your opponent's play, and Crashing Footfalls for free, or Living End for free, or Restore Balance for free, that's actually pretty ridiculous. So we might have to see, maybe we can bring back this Electro Dominance As Foretold Living End style deck. Maybe we can build a mono blue version now. Now that we have Press the Enemy and As Foretold, maybe that's enough that you don't even need to be in red in this deck and Restore Balance or whatever. So in that archetype in specific, I think Press Enemy is actually really exciting. In Commander, I think the most interesting aspect is it can kind of work like Mana Drain, where if you can bounce a high mana value permanent, you can kind of cast any or instant or sorcery from your hand for free. So imagine, like, I played a game of Commander recently where someone mana drained a Galta, and they made 12 mana, and then they just went off and won the game as a result of being able to use all that extra mana. That's kind of ridiculous. Press the Enemy, not going to be as explosive, but it can do something kind of similar. If you bounce a Galta with your Press the Enemy, or, you know, bounce it on the stack or the battlefield, you're going to be able to play essentially any instant or sorcery from your hand. So you can be dropping a Blatant Thievery, a Magma Opus, a Nexus of Fate, some 7 mana, 8 mana instant or sorcery, which kind of turns this into a weird ritual in some scenarios, where if you can use this on something high mana value, it can actually be a pseudo counter spell that generates mana, which is where you get that comparison to Mana Drain. Not nearly as good as Mana Drain, not saying that by any stretch, but you can kind of squint hard enough and see the comparison. So Press the Enemy, it seems fun. Like, it's a fun card. I think it's a little bit too much mana to be super competitive. Even in Commander, 4 mana is a lot, although it does solve one of the big issues with counter spells, which is the nightmare of counter spells is you leave up 4 mana to cast your counter spell, and your opponent just doesn't play anything worth countering, and then you wasted that mana, essentially. Press Enemy gets around that with its bounce mode. Worst case, if your opponent doesn't play something that you need to bounce, well, you can just bounce something from the battlefield. Although it is worth mentioning, it is a pretty soft counter. You're just bouncing the spell back to your opponent's hand, so it's really more of a tempo play than a hard counter that's going to answer the threat forever. So I think you really need synergies for this. You need to be using it like a Mana Drain to ramp into a huge spell from your hand early. You need to be casting those no mana value spells that you otherwise are getting stuck in your hand. In those decks, I think Press Enemy is really good. It's just a generic play. 4 mana, a little tiny bit too much for what it does. Finally today, in the realm of lower rarity cards, actually not a ton to talk about. A couple of lower rarity legends. You can see everything over at MTGpreviews.com, of course. We got Gwaihir the Windlord, and I gotta say, this might be the worst bird commander I have ever seen. 6 mana 4/4, costs 2 less to cast if you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn. Flying and Vigilance, other birds you control have Vigilance. So even if you want to play birds in Commander, there's just better options. Either Kangi is better, Akeem, team, I guess you're in Jeskai rather than straight Azorious, but that's better. Honestly, Gwaihir's so underpowered. I don't even know if I would play this in a Kengi deck if I was playing Bird Tribal. I guess maybe the bar is low enough on birds that you still would play it just because there's not a ton of great options. But honestly, the card feels pretty bad. So I don't know, maybe I'm missing something and this card is way better than I think. But to me, this looks like one of the least powerful uncommon legends from the set. On the other hand, we got Theoden, King of Rohan, which is actually pretty spicy. So 3 mana 2/3, legendary human noble. It says when it or another human enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gains double strike until end of turn. So I think that last bit of text, another human entering the battlefield under your control, I think that's what can make this card pretty scary. I can see a comparison to like Bruce Tarl. I wouldn't say I would be excited to play Theoden as my commander, but in a human tribal deck, the ability to just give double strike to things, maybe multiple things, maybe everything on a 3 mana 2/3 body can be a very strong effect at closing out the game. Bruce Tarl just coming down and throwing double strike and also lifelink is something. That's a really scary way to Voltron someone out of the game. And one of the things humans is really good at is going wide. There's tons of way to make human tokens. There's tons of cheap creatures. Imagine like Gwaihir Kudro, one of the most popular human commanders. 4 mana 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human soldier creature token for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. Your other humans get +2/+0. So it by itself can be making 2, 3, 4 human tokens. Each one of those human tokens, if you have Theoden on the battlefield, is going to trigger Theoden to give something double strike. So if you're giving 3 or 4 creatures double strike, you're probably just killing someone. Like double strike is a lot of damage. So if you're a go wide aggro style of humans deck that is also in the Boros colors, like Gwaihir Kudro, Shashkia, Sylvar and Tenar, the partner pairing, if you're that style of deck, I think that Theoden's actually very worth it in the 99 is a relatively on-curve threat that can actually just give your entire team accidentally double strike every single turn until your opponents die. So as a commander, I think there's better options, but in the 99, I think Theoden is actually a pretty legit human, especially if your goal is to be aggro and go wide. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth spoilers for today. So kind of a short, I guess, the weekend. Things will pick back up next week on Monday. In the meantime, what do you think of today's cards? What are you most hyped for? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow or maybe Monday, depending on how many spoilers we get over the weekend, with even more Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth spoilers. Until then, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you soon.